Beneath the shattered ruins of Europe in 1945, when nations struggled to rebuild from rubble and smouldering fields, another battle quietly began. A war not of armies, but of memory, secrecy, and deliberate erasure. The victors wrote headlines of liberation, justice, and reconstruction, but in locked filing cabinets and sealed vaults. Fragments of truth were buried under red tape, stamped top secret and forgotten by design. Hidden beneath familiar histories are events too dark for textbooks, operations too cruel for official acknowledgement, and decisions so catastrophic that silence was deemed safer than revelation. What the world was allowed to know was carefully chosen. What it was forbidden to know was condemned to archives marked classified until 2045, or worse, destroyed entirely. Yet documents surface, testimonies leak, and rumors persist like shadows cast across a century. The forgotten convoys, the vanished villages, the erased names. They whisper of wars within the war, where civilian lives became experiments, soldiers became expendable assets, and governments chose denial over admission. These are not tales of battlefield glory. They are the stories that smell of ink and ash, stamped with faded insignias, hidden in basements of ministries, or whispered by dying agents who carried their secrets too long. Each uncovered file reopens a wound, reminding us that beneath the flags of victory, darker agreements and unspeakable operations unfolded, unseen by the public eye. To open these files is to step into corridors of betrayal, to confront the chilling possibility that truth was the first casualty of the Second World War. Chapter 1. Operation Iron Wolf Disappearances. The surviving fragments of Unternehmen Eisenwolf first emerge in a thin, weather-stained folder catalogued under Abwehr Case 243, later cross-referenced in Soviet intelligence archives as File GRU 7743. Its cover bears the stamp Geheime Reichssache, Reich, Secret Matter, and a faded signature believed to belong to Colonel Erwin von Lahausen, one of the few Abwehr officers known to have maintained private notes outside official channels. What those pages reveal is neither a conventional military campaign nor a standard reprisal against resistance forces. Instead, they describe the systematic erasure of civilian settlements along the Bug River Basin in the bitter winter of 1943. Villages with centuries of history were struck from Wehrmacht maps, their inhabitants deported, vanished, or exterminated in ways that left no traceable record. Reports intercepted by Soviet patrols mention entire columns of armored transports entering small towns under cover of snowstorms, escorted not only by Totenkopf SS detachments, but by experimental warfare units, groups designated W-Versuchsgruppe, whose existence is otherwise unknown in Nazi military registries. These formations were allegedly under direct orders from Heinrich Himmler himself, bypassing conventional Wehrmacht command structures. They arrived at night, sealed off perimeters, and carried with them unmarked containers, later identified through abandoned wreckage as dispersal equipment suited for chemical agents. Survivors of the Polish Home Army who observed from forested high ground swore that no firefight ensued. Instead, silence fell over the settlements, followed by hours of acrid smoke rising into the sky. By dawn, the villages were gone, structures still standing, but devoid of life, with doors left swinging and livestock untethered. When Red Army scouts entered several of these ghost towns weeks later, they discovered not bodies but residues. Entire homes were dusted with fine powder-like traces that corroded metal tools and left soldiers coughing blood after prolonged exposure. NKVD chemists recovered fragments of glass ampules embedded in the soil, suggesting some form of airborne dispersal test had taken place. The official Soviet reaction was to seal all reports and classify the matter as politically destabilizing, an internal code meaning disclosure could undermine wartime alliances and civilian morale. Stalin's directive, as preserved in a surviving telegram dated February 17, 1943, was unambiguous. No publication. Restrict to counterintelligence. Archive under indefinite lock, but rumors persisted. Local partisans carried stories of ghostly lights moving in the forests at night, of German trucks marked with wolf insignias unloading barrels into shallow pits, and of an officer known only as Der Arzt, believed to be a physician from the SS's Ahnenerbe research wing. Some accounts mentioned trains leaving Brest-Litovsk with detainees, their destination marked only as Wolfsfeld. No such place appears on any map, though an obscure Gestapo ledger references Wolfsfeld Lager, a site associated with special biological Research. Testimonies from captured SS non-commissioned officers during post-war interrogations align with this narrative. One corporal, questioned in 1947 by American CIC officers in Munich, described being stationed near Chaum when orders arrived to escort biological cargo under the insignia of a wolf's head stamped in crimson. He admitted never seeing the cargo directly, only that guards were ordered to wear masks and that sealed crates leaked an acrid odor. His deposition was filed but never presented at Nuremberg, likely because Allied prosecutors feared diluting charges with unverifiable accounts. Equally troubling is the connection drawn in declassified CIA memoranda from the 1950s during Operation Paperclip, when US intelligence sought to recruit German scientists. Among names flagged for denied entry was Dr. Klaus Reinhardt, noted as linked to Eisenwolf operations, suspected chemical field trials on civilian population. Reinhardt's post-war whereabouts remain unknown. Some reports suggest he was smuggled into Argentina, while others claim he was absorbed into Soviet programs. Neither Moscow nor Washington ever acknowledged harboring him, leaving a gaping hole in accountability. Eyewitness testimony from Polish villagers provides the only human detail amid these fractured records. A farmer named Jan Nowak, interviewed by underground resistance before his execution by German patrols, described seeing a convoy enter the hamlet of Mielnik. They wore black insignia with a wolf's head, he recounted, and carried canisters unlike anything I'd seen. The air turned heavy. Dogs howled until their throats bled. By morning, my cousins could not breathe, their eyes white as snow. This testimony, preserved in microfilm by the Polish government in exile in London, was dismissed at the time as partisan exaggeration. Only decades later, when Soviet chemical warfare archives began to unravel, did it acquire chilling plausibility. The strategic aim of Operation Iron Wolf remains elusive. Historians speculate it may have been a series of field tests for tabun or sarin nerve agents, both known to be produced in Germany by 1942, though never officially deployed in combat. Another theory suggests bacteriological trials tied to typhus or plague cultures, given the Reich's desperation to weaponize disease. A 1946 British intelligence briefing, recently declassified, concluded that Iron Wolf was an experimental precursor to area denial via biological vector, terminology far ahead of its time. Yet no definitive evidence has surfaced. The most haunting fact is that the villages themselves disappeared not just physically, but administratively. Censuses taken in 1946 list them as abandoned ruins, later absorbed into collective farmland without memorial or acknowledgement. Even today, some of their names are absent from official Polish registers, as though they never existed. Maps redrawn in the post-war years omit them entirely, erasing their identity along with the lives lost. In that silence, a question lingers. How many other Iron Wolf sites remain undiscovered, buried beneath forest regrowth or Soviet concrete foundations? Decades after the war, when fragments of file GRU 7743 surfaced, Russian archivists remarked that entire sections had been deliberately cut out with razor blades, leaving only headers such as subject field application and casualties not recorded. Western intelligence agencies, when confronted with these gaps, quietly shifted their focus to the broader narrative of Nazi atrocities already proven in courts. The smaller, more ambiguous horrors like Iron Wolf were left in the shadows, too obscure for public trials, yet too monstrous to reconcile with claims of total historical disclosure. To reconstruct Operation Iron Wolf today is to piece together ash and whispers. It is the story of vanished maps, erased names, and silent ruins that testify to a different kind of war, one waged not for territory or ideology, but for data. Human beings reduced to experimental entries in logbooks that no longer exist, erased deliberately to deny closure. In the snowbound forests of eastern Poland, beneath soil enriched by unmarked graves and chemical residues, lies a history the world was never meant to exhume. And yet, like smoke rising from ruins long extinguished, its traces refuse to disappear. Chapter 2: The Vanished Convoy of Murmansk. On March 12, 1942, Convoy PQ-17 departed Reykjavik under a veil of secrecy, bound for the Arctic port of Murmansk. To the public record, PQ-17 consisted of 35 merchant vessels, escorted by a formidable shield of destroyers, cruisers, and corvettes tasked with delivering vital supplies to the Soviet Union. The official narrative records catastrophic losses when the convoy was ordered to scatter in July, leaving many ships vulnerable to Luftwaffe bombers and prowling U-boats. Yet buried deep within declassified Admiralty archives lies mention of an additional detachment. 8 merchant ships never acknowledged in Lloyd's lists, carrying cargo classified only as strategic machinery. These ghost vessels appear fleetingly, in signals intercepted by Bletchley Park and in coded German naval dispatches, referring to an auxiliary fleet west of Bear Island. And then, as if swallowed by the Arctic night, they vanish. No wreckage confirmed, no survivors recovered, and no mention in post-war accounts. Surviving fragments suggest something far more unsettling than poor navigation or enemy attack. A declassified Royal Navy memorandum dated April 1946, stamped "Most secret, do not circulate," hints that the missing detachment carried prototype equipment intended for Soviet inspection. Among the listed cargo, now redacted in surviving documents, were items marked classified machinery, non-conventional. Naval historians speculate these may have included early radar prototypes, jet propulsion components, or even uranium ore shipments from Canada, meant to strengthen Soviet research. The political implications were dire. Evidence of clandestine technology, transfers that contradicted public statements of cautious cooperation. Winston Churchill's own war diary contains an ambiguous entry around that time, lamenting the heavy loss of valuable cargo, which must remain unspoken. The deliberate vagueness fuels suspicion that the convoy carried materials neither Britain nor the United States wished to admit had been promised to Stalin. German records add another dimension. Kriegsmarine war diaries captured after the war mention shadowing auxiliary tonnage detached from PQ-17. One entry dated June 26, 1942, describes Admiral Raeder's interest in a mysterious cluster of vessels not matching intelligence reports, suggesting the Germans too were confused by their sudden appearance. A Luftwaffe pilot interrogated after capture recalled being ordered to photograph a small convoy formation near Jan Mayen Island, only to have the negatives confiscated and replaced with routine reconnaissance prints. The photographs never resurfaced. Whether those ships were sunk, diverted, or intercepted remains unanswered. For the sailors tasked with escort duty, the secrecy was palpable. Testimony collected decades later from a surviving officer aboard HMS Somme. Keppel recalls receiving sealed orders instructing destroyers to withdraw from auxiliary formation and resume primary escort. The officer admitted he never understood why 8 vessels, all painted in standard convoy colors, were suddenly stripped of escort and left to navigate alone through waters infested with U-boats. When pressed in later interviews, he described his sense of betrayal, remarking, "We left them to the wolves not by accident, but by order." His words echo the unease found in Soviet documents demanding accountability. Stalin himself, in a telegram to Churchill dated August 1942, questioned the disappearance of cargo previously promised to the Soviet state. The response, preserved in Foreign Office files, avoided the subject entirely, focusing instead on German aggression and the bravery of Allied sailors. Soviet archives, partially opened in the 1990s, add chilling corroboration. NKVD cables reveal frustration and suspicion, noting that certain deliveries of promised machinery have failed to arrive without explanation from British partners. A classified GRU summary dated October 1942 records Stalin's belief that the cargo had been deliberately withheld, possibly as leverage in negotiations over the opening of a second front in Western Europe. The summary's marginal notes, scrawled in red pencil, underline the word betrayal 3 times. If the Soviet leadership truly believed that London had abandoned the ships intentionally, it would explain the enduring distrust that poisoned Allied relations even before the Cold War had officially begun. Adding to the mystery is the complete absence of wreckage. Unlike other ships from PQ-17, whose rusting hulks have been discovered on the seabed north of Norway, no trace of the 8 auxiliary vessels has ever been confirmed. Modern sonar surveys conducted in the Barents Sea during the 1990s failed to locate them, fueling speculation that they may have been diverted elsewhere under classified orders. Some theories suggest they turned toward neutral Sweden, where clandestine trade with both Allies and Axis powers was not uncommon. Others point toward Icelandic fjords, where records of temporary moorings were deliberately scrubbed. Without evidence, the fate of the convoy remains one of maritime history's most enduring enigmas. Perhaps the most unsettling element lies in US intelligence documents declassified only in 2012. Within the OSS archive is a brief reference to Operation Goliath, a code name applied to special tonnage rerouted under Arctic convoy cover. The document, though only a single page, implies that American intelligence was aware of the diversion and even authorized it, citing strategic considerations of atomic development. While no details follow, the tantalizing possibility arises that the missing cargo contained uranium ore, bound not for the Soviet Union but secretly redirected toward Allied nuclear programs. If true, this would represent one of the earliest deceptions of wartime cooperation, planting the seeds of mistrust that blossomed into the Cold War. Eyewitnesses among merchant sailors describe final sightings with haunting detail. A Norwegian crewman aboard the SS Ocean Voice later told investigators he saw 8 ships veer northward under orders delivered by a fast-approaching launch. Their lights were doused, and they disappeared into fog banks rolling off the ice fields. "We thought they had special escort, or perhaps a different port," he recounted, "but they were never seen again. It was as if the sea swallowed them whole." His testimony, preserved in Norwegian maritime archives, was considered too unreliable for formal inclusion in British records. Yet decades later, it remains one of the few first-hand descriptions of the detachment's final moments. The vanished convoy of Murmansk has since become the subject of speculation, from conspiracy theories of Allied betrayal to darker suspicions of deliberate scuttling. In the absence of physical wrecks or survivor accounts, historians are left with shadows in the archives. Redacted cargo lists, contradictory telegrams, and whispers of secret protocols never meant for public knowledge. Whether the ships carried experimental weaponry, atomic materials, or sensitive intelligence hardware, the pattern is clear. The world was told only half the truth. The other half vanished into Arctic waters, locked in silence by governments unwilling to reveal the full scope of their wartime dealings. The frozen sea holds its secrets well, and the vanished convoy remains both a tragedy and a warning, a ghost fleet that continues to haunt the historical record. Chapter 3. Gestapo File Number 17, Prague. When Allied troops stormed the ruins of Prague in May 1945, they discovered more than crumbling bunkers and abandoned SS uniforms. In the basement of the Sicherheitsdienst headquarters on Bartolomewska Street, beneath charred beams and waterlogged filing cabinets, lay a collection of half-burned dossiers. Among them was a folder scorched at the edges, marked Akte 17, Sonderbehandlung. Its survival was almost accidental, preserved only because it had fallen into a crack between 2 concrete slabs. What the surviving pages reveal points to one of the darkest and least acknowledged chapters of the Reich's occupation of Czechoslovakia. The abduction, disappearance, and probable experimentation upon hundreds of intellectuals, resistance leaders and ordinary citizens. Unlike other files that catalogue deportations to Theresienstadt or Auschwitz, file number 17 makes no mention of known camps. Instead, it contains directives signed by Reinhard Heydrich himself, written just weeks before his assassination in June 1942, ordering that selected detainees be transferred for biological examination, location undisclosed. Contemporaneous witness reports describe night trains leaving Prague's Smíchov freight station under SS guard. These trains carried men and women whose names were never entered in concentration camp ledgers, their fates scrubbed from every registry. Soviet interrogators who later captured Gestapo officers in Dresden extracted chilling admissions. The prisoners had not been sent east for resettlement, but diverted to a hidden facility beneath the Ore Mountains. That area, straddling the border of Bohemia and Saxony, was already known to house secret uranium mines, resources critical to Germany's atomic research. The connection raises grim possibilities. Surviving testimony from a Czech railway worker states that the trains bore hazardous cargo markings, the same symbols later associated with radioactive material. When he asked about the prisoners, an SS guard reportedly sneered, "They are cargo as well." American Counterintelligence Corps reports written in 1946 but declassified only in the 1980s mention rumors of an underground complex near Jakimov, guarded by SS units with orders to shoot intruders on sight. The mine shafts there were deep, cold, and perfect for secrecy. Survivors from the surrounding villages recall hearing distant machinery at night and seeing smoke pour from ventilation stacks hidden among the trees. Yet no official acknowledgement of such a facility has ever been made. Instead, post-war Soviet authorities cordoned off the region, declaring it a restricted security zone until the late 1950s, effectively erasing any chance for independent investigation. The testimony of prisoners who briefly survived Gestapo custody offers harrowing detail. One Czech physician, Dr. Jan Vesely, arrested in 1942 and later released due to clerical error, recalled seeing dozens of detainees in chains, selected by a man in a white coat wearing SS insignia. Vesely overheard fragments of conversation in German, subject allocation, and dose measurement. Though his account was dismissed at the time as hysteria, fragments of file number 17 corroborate his memory. One surviving sheet refers to Biologische Versuchsreihe 17a, Biological Test Series 17a, alongside a list of prisoner identification numbers. None of those numbers correspond to known concentration camp archives. Soviet archival material provides further confirmation, though cloaked in bureaucratic euphemism. A 1947 NKVD memo notes the recovery of sealed chambers containing contaminated equipment, highly unusual in construction, discovered in the Ore Mountains. The memo was classified at the highest level, stamped, "Do not disseminate to allies." What contaminated equipment meant was never explained. The Soviet investigators closed the shafts with concrete and declared the matter a state secret. Their silence suggests the evidence found within was too dangerous to reveal, not only for what it said about Nazi crimes, but also for its potential value in the emerging nuclear and biological arms race. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence is the final page of file number 17. Scrawled in red pencil, beneath a typed directive, is a chilling handwritten order. No trace shall remain for foreign investigators. The order was initialed, though the name remains disputed. Some experts claim it was SS Obergruppenführer Karl Hermann Frank, Heydrich's ruthless deputy in Prague. Others insist the signature matches Dr. Hans Kammler, the SS general overseeing secret weapons projects. Whoever gave the order, its meaning is unmistakable. The prisoners were to be eliminated in ways that left no evidence, their bodies incinerated or entombed in sealed shafts that would never be opened. For decades, both Soviet and East German governments actively suppressed discussion of the missing Czechs. Families who asked questions were told their relatives had perished in ordinary deportations. Western historians, denied access to archives behind the Iron Curtain, were left with little more than rumors. Only in the 1990s, after the fall of communism, did Czech researchers gain partial access to Soviet files. What they uncovered were references to Case Prague 17, still heavily redacted, but acknowledging that hundreds of civilians were unaccounted for, presumed deceased, in the context of special biological research. The language was cold, bureaucratic, and devoid of human recognition. The unresolved fate of the disappeared intellectuals continues to haunt Czech memory. In villages across Bohemia, oral histories speak of loved ones taken in the night, of trains that never returned, of names erased from every official document. Families keep faded photographs on mantles, their only evidence that these men and women once lived. To them, file number 17 is not an abstract document, but the last surviving trace of fathers, mothers, and children swallowed by the Nazi machine. The silence imposed by both Nazi and Soviet authorities compounds the wound, creating a void where truth should be. Gestapo file number 17 forces us to confront a terrifying reality: that beyond the known horrors of Auschwitz and Dachau, there were other sites, smaller and more secret, where human beings became raw material for experiments. These places left no memorials, no liberation photographs, and no survivor testimonies, only fragments of paper charred at the edges. The fact that governments on both sides of the Cold War chose silence rather than disclosure suggests the experiments conducted in Prague may have held implications too grave for public acknowledgement. Was it radiation exposure? Biological weapons testing? Early attempts at understanding uranium's lethal effects on the human body? Whatever the truth, it lies buried beneath concrete, sealed in mines now reclaimed by Earth, and hidden in archives that remain inaccessible. File number 17 remains an open wound in the historical record, a reminder that not every atrocity was revealed at Nuremberg. and that some crimes were deliberately buried under layers of secrecy. As each year passes, fewer witnesses remain alive to testify, and the voices of the disappeared grow fainter. Yet the folder that surfaced in Prague, blackened by fire but not destroyed, refuses to let history forget. It whispers from the archives, demanding answers that governments still withhold, and reminding us that beneath the official histories, darker truths wait in silence. Chapter 4: The Black Protocol of Yalta. History remembers the Yalta Conference of February 1945 as a triumph of Allied unity, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin gathered in the Crimean resort to shape the post-war world. The official records describe negotiations over Poland's borders, the fate of Germany, and the founding of the United Nations. Yet buried beneath the familiar photographs of smiling leaders lies a darker, unacknowledged annex. A set of secret understandings whispered about in the corridors of intelligence agencies and preserved only in scattered fragments across Soviet and British archives. Known within MI6 circles as the Black Protocol, this hidden agreement never appeared in official transcripts. Its rumored contents point not to cooperation, but to betrayal, the silent sacrifice of nations and lives in exchange for fragile promises of stability. Unlike the public agreements celebrated in press releases, the Black Protocol carried no signatures visible to history, only initials scrawled in margins and ciphered telegrams confirming special understandings. The first reference surfaces in a Soviet Foreign Ministry memo dated March 3, 1945, classified at the highest level. It notes Stalin's satisfaction that the Western partners have affirmed conditions of Protocol B. No protocol. B exists in the published record of Yalta. Analysts who later studied the phrasing concluded it must have referred to a separate annex, withheld from public scrutiny. British files declassified in the 1970s reinforced this suspicion. In a Foreign Office briefing marked "Not for Hansard," meaning never to be disclosed in Parliament, one line stands out. Our obligations under the Black Protocol must remain unwritten, save in the archives of His Majesty's government. The choice of words suggests deliberate concealment, an understanding that some bargains struck in Yalta could never withstand public light. What did the Black Protocol contain? Fragments point towards secret transfers of prisoners of war and forced repatriations, particularly concerning Soviet citizens who had fought against Stalin or fled westward during the war. Known as Operation Keelhaul in later Western records, the forced return of Cossacks, white émigrés, and even captured Soviet soldiers to Stalin's regime resulted in mass executions and deportations to Gulag camps. Official histories describe this as an unfortunate consequence of wartime agreements. But the Black Protocol hints at something more deliberate, a calculated trade-off where the West quietly agreed to Stalin's demands in exchange for guarantees regarding zones of occupation and Soviet entry into the war against Japan. The price was thousands of lives handed over to certain death, their fates concealed beneath the euphemism of repatriation. American intelligence files provide further shadows. A declassified OSS memorandum dated May 1945 refers to the darker annex of Yalta and warns of political fallout should knowledge of it reach displaced persons camps. The memo emphasizes the need for strict control of narrative to prevent unrest among refugees. This aligns with testimonies of British soldiers who, stationed in Austria and northern Italy, were ordered to hand over groups of Cossack families, men, women, and children, to Soviet authorities at gunpoint. Many of these soldiers, writing memoirs decades later, confessed the horror of watching their charges dragged away, some committing suicide rather than face forced return. Yet at the time, official orders framed these transfers as lawful obligations under Allied agreement. The secrecy extended beyond forced repatriations. Soviet archival material suggests the Black Protocol also outlined concessions regarding Eastern Europe's political future, particularly in Poland and the Balkans. While public declarations promised free elections, private correspondence indicates that Roosevelt and Churchill, exhausted by years of war and desperate for Soviet cooperation, tacitly acknowledged Stalin's sphere of influence. One GRU summary report bluntly states, "The Western powers have accepted our control of Eastern Europe in principle, provided certain gestures of democracy are observed." That cynical phrasing reveals the depth of duplicity. For millions in Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest, liberation from Nazi rule merely transitioned into subjugation under Moscow. a betrayal sealed in an annex that never officially existed. Even the Americans left clues. A White House stenographer's diary, recovered in the 1970s from personal papers, records Roosevelt's weariness during the conference and his comment to an aide, "Better to yield quietly now than to risk Stalin's retreat." If accurate, this remark underscores how the Black Protocol emerged not from strength, but from exhaustion, a desperate calculus to keep the alliance intact until Germany surrendered. Roosevelt's failing health, his face pale in photographs, his voice thin in recordings, only deepened the impression that Yalta was shaped by men already preparing for the war's end, rather than its moral reckoning. For decades, references to the Black Protocol remained buried, dismissed as Cold War propaganda or fringe speculation. Yet the consistency of the fragments across multiple archives, British Foreign Office memoranda, Soviet diplomatic cables, and American intelligence reports, suggests that something tangible did exist. Historians piecing together these clues argue that the protocol functioned as an unofficial appendix, a verbal pact reinforced by private notes, never intended for public release. Its concealment was deliberate, its execution ruthless, and its consequences profound. The legacy of the Black Protocol remains visible in the scars of Eastern Europe. Families torn apart by forced repatriation, nations trapped behind the Iron Curtain, and generations silenced by censorship, all trace back to decisions made in gilded halls at Yalta, behind closed doors and guarded smiles. Official photographs show Roosevelt draped in a blanket, Churchill with cigar in hand, Stalin leaning forward in apparent camaraderie. But behind those images lies the reality of bargaining chips measured in human lives, traded without consent, their sacrifices never acknowledged. Today, the protocol remains one of history's forbidden texts. No original document has surfaced, and perhaps none ever will. Its existence is confirmed only in shadows, redacted lines, missing annexes, and whispered testimonies of officials who dared to hint at truths their governments denied. In that void, the Black Protocol becomes more than a treaty. It becomes a symbol of suppressed history, where the victors chose silence over accountability. The war may have ended in triumph, but in the archives of Yalta, the ink of betrayal runs darker than victory's banners. In the shattered aftermath of the Second World War, the world was told a carefully crafted story of good versus evil, of liberation over tyranny, and of justice delivered at Nuremberg. Yet as the decades passed, fragments began to surface from vaults and archives, fragments that tell of missing villages, ghost fleets, erased prisoners, and secret treaties never meant for public view. These were not the stories of battlefield valor carved into monuments, but the hidden ledger of betrayal, silence, and deliberate suppression. Operation Iron Wolf erased communities from the map as if they had never existed, their fate written only in chemical residue and partisan whispers. The vanished convoy to Murmansk reminds us that the sea itself can become a graveyard for truths, swallowing evidence of secret cargo and diplomatic duplicity. Gestapo file number 17, blackened by fire yet still legible, forces recognition that some atrocities were buried not by chance but by design, their victims condemned to vanish twice, once in life and once in history. And the Black Protocol of Yalta, cloaked in euphemism and absence, reveals how victory was bartered with compromises that sentenced millions to decades of silence under iron rule. Together, these fragments confront us with the unsettling reality that war does not end when the guns fall silent. It lingers in erased names, censored files, and unmarked graves. As more archives open, one question remains. How many truths are still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be unearthed? And how many will remain buried forever beneath the concrete of official silence?